I'd like to move on at this point to the next presentation, which is an update from our outside counsel, Nick Regano, regarding the Superfund site. As many in the public will know, that there has been concerns over PFAS, PFOA, fluorinated chemicals contaminating groundwater. Hello, Nicholas.
Hello, Supervisor.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. You have a presentation to bring folks up to date on the status of the Superfund site.
Yes.
Designated by the New York State DC regarding PFAS, PFOA.
Yes, I do. And I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen here. Okay, can you see a presentation?
Yes.
On the screen? Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
Okay, so as the supervisor mentioned, I am outside counsel to the town of East Hampton with respect to the airport Superfund site, as well as with respect to the town's efforts to mitigate its liability through litigation and otherwise. And so I wanted to present to the public today as to the status of the Superfund process, give an overall update, and compare, where the town is to where we expect to be going forward, as well as where other sites that are similar to the town's airport site are, where we sit today. So let's move to the first slide. So as the supervisor mentioned, the contaminants of concern here are PFAS. And so PFAS is a group of around 4,000, maybe more, man-made chemicals. They don't exist in nature. They primarily are comprised of fluorine and carbon bonds. The most studied PFAS chemicals are PFOA and PFOS, which have been designated as hazardous substances under New York law. On August 26, 2020, New York State issued maximum contaminant levels, which are binding drinking water levels of these contaminants of 10 parts per trillion each. And just as a frame of reference, it's almost like spitting in an ocean. And it's 1 part per billion is equivalent to a single drop, approximately equivalent to a single drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. 10 parts per trillion amounts to approximately 100 times less than that. Meaning, if you combine 100 Olympic-sized swimming pools and put a single drop in it, that would reach the level at issue here. So the levels at which DEC or the state regulates these contaminants are very, very low. PFOA and PFOS and other chemicals have been used, as many of you know, in many products for decades, including a product called aqueous film forming foam, or what nomenclature out there is AFFF. So what is AFFF? AFFF is a fire suppression foam used by fire departments, the military, et cetera, to extinguish Class B fires, which often involve jet fuel. As a result, PFAS contamination has been detected throughout the country at airports, fire stations, and fire training areas, among other sites, also military sites as well. So we know the town airport has been designated as a Superfund site. That is the result of PFAS compounds and really the result of AFFF, that fire suppression foam we just mentioned, being used. So AFFF was not stored or used by the town based on our diligence that we've conducted. Instead, it was used by the East Hampton Fire Department. The East Hampton Fire Department is not operated by the town, but instead it's operated by the village. And we've attempted to work closely with the village on this, but have not received the level of cooperation that we've hoped to receive. In 2016, the town received a form survey from DEC to disclose all locations where or events in which AFFF was used at the airport or surrounding areas. Because the town did not use AFFF, the town passed the survey along to the fire department since they had the information. The fire department completed the survey and confirmed that AFFF was unfortunately used and stored at and around the airport. The town also completed its own survey in accordance with DEC's request that effectively said, the fire department had the information. There were some additional disclosures in the town survey, but that's effectively what the town disclosed to DEC, which is accurate. DEC then used this information as well as other information based on investigations that have been conducted throughout the country, and determined that the investigation of the airport, a preliminary investigation of the airport, was warranted. And so to facilitate that investigation, the town board, and I know Jim Brundage is on as well, diligently combed through records, pictures, interviewed fire department personnel, and ultimately obtained information to submit to DEC to facilitate their initial investigation of the airport. And that investigation did result in detections of PFOA and PFOS in both the soil and groundwater, not only at the airport, but also there's a fire station just south of the airport on Industrial Road, as well as a fire training facility on Industrial Road as well. And so DEC conducted a preliminary investigation at those sites and determined that PFOA and PFOS were detected in the soil and groundwater at those sites. So before all that occurred, well, after the survey was completed and before DEC did that investigation, Suffolk County Department of Health Services also conducted its own investigation throughout Wainscott of private drinking water wells of Wainscott residents that are located down gradient or downstream, really, of the airport property, and found that levels of PFOA and PFOS were detected in some private drinking water wells of certain Wainscott residents. That sampling occurred in 2017. And after analyzing the results, Suffolk County issued a water quality advisory on October 11, 2017. And it's important to note that within that notice, again, this is really the first public notice made by any health body or regulatory agency indicating that there was an issue. Within that notice, the notice stated, as a precaution, the town of East Hampton has offered to provide bottled water to property owners in the private well survey area as described above. So, real kudos to the town board for being on top of this really in advance or with Suffolk County and the regulators, as they really could not have acted quicker. Within the first 2 months of that water quality advisory, the town began discussions with Suffolk County Water Authority and ultimately agreed to pay for the extension of the public water main, which is now a completed project. The project was really unprecedented. It called for a 9-mile water main extension throughout Wainscott. And as I mentioned, the project's complete, cost the town a little over $7 million total. And that's really to extend the water main itself. And throughout this whole process to date, the DEC has found that all the town's actions have been necessary and appropriate. So we're left now with the 3 properties, the airport, the fire station, and the fire training facility. And so, there's 2 different, I guess I'll call them mantras in the environmental world. You want to protect, obviously, public health. That's of paramount importance. But you also want to protect the environment. And simply by, extending the water main, that may protect public health, but the environment is still impacted. And so DEC did designate the properties as a Class 2 Superfund site due to the PFOA and PFOS detections in soil and groundwater at these 3 properties. It's of note that the entire airport is not, at this point, designated as a Superfund site. Around 47 acres of the airport is designated as a Superfund site. It's primarily the northeastern area of the airport is really where the Superfund designation lies. The entirety of the fire station property and the entirety of the fire training facility property are designated as Superfund sites. So this contamination was caused by the fire department's use and storage of AFFF. As we mentioned, that's the fire suppression foam that contains these compounds in response to fires and for training. There's no evidence, this is of note, or allegation of any intentional polluting activity such as dumping. It was simply use in response to crashes, training, and potentially storage as well, with leaking would occur. The town has hired the best environmental consultant, in my view, on Long Island, FPM Group. And to date, the town has worked very closely with DEC. The town has submitted a citizen participation plan, an investigation work plan to DEC for approval. The town has been waiting for DEC to approve that investigation work plan for months. And, we need that DEC approval before proceeding. Everything has to be done throughout this process with DEC approval. The town did sign, as I mentioned, a consent order with DEC, and that does, again, kudos to the town board for doing so. It allows the town to investigate and remediate these properties and really further protect public health and the environment with DEC oversight and approval. Without signing that consent order, it really would drag on the process much longer because DEC would be forced to do it themselves and pay for it, and it would just ultimately be a disaster. And ultimately, if that was the process that the town thought to pursue, in which DEC would go ahead and do everything themselves, DEC would ultimately, at the end of the day, sue the town for all of its costs incurred anyway. So there's really no point in proceeding in that manner. So the town board, in my view, made the correct decision in executing the consent order upon DEC's demand. So the next steps in the Superfund process, as I mentioned, we have the investigation work plan pending. The town expects to have DEC approval with respect to that work plan shortly, likely within the next 30 days. Sampling will likely commence this summer. The purpose of the sampling is to determine how deep, how far, and how much contamination there is at, around, and emanating from the airport. This process will likely take a few years. And it's of note that the purpose of this sampling that will be conducted is different than the sampling that DEC conducted. DEC conducted sampling only to identify whether the contaminants exist at the site. And really, they do that to determine whether a site should be designated as a Superfund site. The sampling the town will conduct under DEC oversight and approval is really the sampling necessary to determine how to remediate the contamination. So it's not to identify it, it's to figure out how deep and how far and where we have to ultimately remediate the contamination. And so this process will take a few years to do. It's a very big process because it does appear that the contamination has flowed off-site, but no definitive conclusion on that yet. That's part of the sampling process. And then once the sampling process is complete, again, it'll take a few years, DEC will consider all the remedial alternatives after considering all the data, and then select the alternative that DEC deems appropriate. And the town will have some input into determining, what is the proper remedial approach here. But ultimately, the town will implement the remedies selected by DEC. Again, the town will have some input there. So that's really the next steps in the process. I would expect DEC's decision not to come for, let's call it 4 or 5 years. It could be less, could be more, but that's the estimate. So wanted to kind of compare where, I guess, the East Hampton Airport lies in comparison to some other sites in New York State with respect to PFOA and PFOS contamination. So the East Hampton Airport to date, based on DEC's investigation, DEC found approximately 299.3 parts per trillion of combined PFOA and PFOS in groundwater. So that's around 30 times the 10 parts per trillion drinking water standard, which, by the way, also doubles down as a groundwater cleanup standard in New York. When you compare those levels with other sites, you'll see that the East Hampton Airport has much lower levels than a lot of the other sites in New York State. Gabreski Airport, which is in, I believe it's Southampton, has almost 60,000 parts per trillion, and that's, I believe, just a PFOS, not PFOA also. Hampton Bay's fire station is 2,400 parts per trillion. The Hoosick Falls landfill, I think if you read about PFOA and PFOS, Hoosick Falls will be one of the first locations that will come up. Has 25,000 parts per trillion, and actually that landfill wasn't the initial culprit as to the contamination detected in Hoosick Falls. It was a manufacturing facility there. Stewart Air Force Base in Newburgh, that's in upstate, 14,800 parts per trillion. The Suffolk County Fire Training Center, 15,000 parts per trillion, and Westchester County Airport has around 65,000, a little more than 65,000 parts per trillion of PFOA and PFOS. So we don't fully know the full extent of the problem at the East Hampton Airport yet, but based on the information we have today, The levels are far lower than many other sites in New York State. So to date, the town has commenced 2 separate lawsuits to recover costs in connection with the water main extension and costs with respect to the Superfund investigation and remediation. The lawsuits have been commenced against over a dozen parties, including multi-billion-dollar companies such as 3M, who actually produced PFOS and firefighting foam, AFFF, and DuPont, who primarily produced PFOA, but also other constituents used in firefighting foam, as well as many other manufacturers and parties for all of the town's damages. There's also a lawsuit that the town separately commenced against the village of East Hampton for operation of the East Hampton Fire Department, which caused the contamination at issue, and the village's insurer. The village has very significant insurance. The town is seeking for that insurer to cover a portion of the town's cost, if not all of it, as well as to obtain information from the village as to where they use AFFF. As I mentioned, it's been not the easiest of goes with the village in obtaining that information to date. Further, a class action was commenced by certain Wayne Scott residents against some of those same manufacturers that the town commenced suit against, including 3M. And the class action was also commenced against the town itself. And then all 3 of these actions were all commenced in New York State courts, whether state or federal courts, but they were all ultimately moved to a multi-district litigation in the District of South Carolina, where over 100 similar cases are pending throughout the entire country. So that's where really the litigation lies. These litigations obviously don't move quickly, but the town is very hopeful that the litigations are strong and will result in significant recoveries against these defendants. That is my presentation, and to the extent anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.